Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure, although I did not arrange this program, it's my pleasure to introduce to you this young man who kindly came to us, Cristhian Flores. He is the Conservation Education Representative for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and works at Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site. Cahokia Mounds, Chris is probably going to tell you this, it's the largest pre-colonial archaeological site north of Mexico and is often referred to as the first American city. This urban center once boasted a population estimated to range anywhere from 10 to 20,000 people around 1050 AD, and the people are called the Mississippian culture. With that, thank you, Mary, who's so good about reminding me and us. Turn off your phones, please. And Chris, thank you for being with us. Chris will take questions, and he's going to decide whether during the talk or after. We'll let that up to him.
All right, guys. Thank you guys for having me. Like she mentioned, my name's Chris. As far as questions, since we have a good-sized crowd, we'll probably just wait till the end. But I certainly do want to get to everyone's question. I'll be honest, if I can or cannot answer your question, I do want to point out I'm not an archaeologist. So she had mentioned I'm the Conservation Education Representative. So what that means is I take what the archaeologists are saying and make it consumable for the public. Just by, out of curiosity, how many people have been to Cahokia Mounds? Oh, I'm very happy to see that. So you guys have some interest, some of this information. You might know yourself, it might refresh some of these things that you came across when you came and visited us. Before we do get started, I do want to mention that our interpretive center is closed for renovations. They're thinking it will take about another year to complete the construction, but fingers crossed it gets done sooner than later. That way you guys can come visit us with family, friends, anyone that might have interest about Cahokia Mounds. I do have some artifacts here that I might kind of talk briefly about, but at the end of the presentation, you guys are all more than welcome to come on up here and take a closer look at these things. So here I have my slide with a nice little illustration of what Cahokia Mounds may have looked like. And so as you can see here, there's a area that we refer to as the Grand Plaza. It's a social communal space. And I got a slide all about that where I'll give you guys a little more information about that. So some information about Cahokia Mounds. It's not only a state historic site, but it's also a World Heritage Site. And so for that reason, we attract visitors from not only all over the country, all over the world. So on my regular days, I also do tours on site. And on most of my tours, I got people from different states. I had a gentleman from France on one of my tours last week. So there's a lot of interest, and with that World Heritage Site designation, it gets a lot more recognition. And so, like she had mentioned, it is ran or managed, at least by the state of Illinois, the Department of Natural Resources. Here we have an aerial shot taken of Monk's Mound and the Twin Mounds. And so this is partially just a glimpse of the site itself. Originally, there were about 4,000 acres. Today, the state manages roughly over half, 2,200 acres. When the Native Americans were here, there were about 120 mounds. Today, only 80 remain, primarily as a result of human development. A lot of the property itself was private before the state acquired this portion of the property. So there was a lot of farming activities going on, and so many of the mounds have actually been plowed in that process. Here's a plaque of the World Heritage Site. So typically when the interpretive center is open, you can see this in the gallery. And so Cahokia Mounds is very proud to be a part of the World Heritage Sites. Here's a nice little timeline of occupation of Cahokia, at least on a long-term basis. So late woodlands is a description for the Native Americans that were semi-still kind of moving on throughout times of the season. Around 700 AD, they noticed that Native Americans are kind of starting to stay in the Cahokia region a little more permanently. And this is primarily because they are actually starting to farm, so they're growing corn. And so archaeologists can see in the soil that the Native Americans are starting to grow corn on a more intense kind of basis. And so, as you might imagine, having more stable food sources allows you to kind of stabilize a community. And so we go forward in time to about 800 AD, and this is when archaeologists can see that now there are more structures and organizations of the way that they're building their homes. And so these agricultural surpluses are allowing them to really think about how they're going to develop the communities. So we can see that society in itself appears to be becoming a little more complex. Around AD 1000 to 1400, this is around the Mississippian culture where it's really thriving at its peak, if you want to think about it like that. And this is around the time period that Cahokia is at its height, when it's that urban center that you might have read about, where it's a very influential kind of complex and city. And this is when they notice that now that people don't have to focus on growing their food, now they can start developing different kinds of craft specialization. And some of this includes some pottery. And so as you can see here, this is a duck. And so a lot of the artifacts that are discovered related to the Mississippian culture seem to incorporate animals. And so here you have another pottery vessel with a beaver. And so the Mississippian culture is the group of people that were living in Cahokia. This isn't one particular tribe, this is multiple tribes practicing similar lifestyles. And so here's a couple characteristics that are associated with the Mississippian culture. So one of the more evident ones might be the construction of platform mounds. So this is a specific kind of mound associated to the Mississippian culture. This Mississippian culture is thought to have spread as far north as like the Great Lakes, as far south as Louisiana, as far east as the Carolinas, and as far west as Oklahoma. And archaeologists are able to say that this culture existed in these numerous locations based on the artifacts they're finding. So they're finding particular kinds of potteries, some that we call shell-tempered pottery. And so this distinct kind of pottery actually involved crushing up mussel shells, typically found near the creeks, the rivers, and they would mix it in with the clay, and this gave it a more distinct speckled kind of look. And so this particular kind of pottery has been discovered in excavations at these numerous locations. Also, at these other parts of the country, they found that there's particular items that makes archaeologists believe that there was extensive trade going on. So there's particular items that aren't local goods that are discovered at Cahokia. So for example, one non-local good is copper. They found copper at Cahokia, and copper is usually actually found near the Great Lakes region. So this gives us an idea that there must have been some kind of trading, or at least encounters with other groups near these regions. So here we have a nice little illustration of the three different kinds of mounds you'll see at Cahokia. So these other locations that are associated with the Mississippian culture were also building platform mounds and conical mounds. But ridgetop mounds, the first illustration you can see, these are actually unique to Cahokia. You won't find these kinds of mounds anywhere else. And so these are longer than wide, typically come to a crest, and they appear to be marker mounds in the sense that they're placed in the north, south, and west and east cardinal directions. And so this gives us an idea that this site itself was very much planned. It doesn't necessarily line up exactly, but considering how close it is, gives us an idea that they had some general knowledge on this. The second kind of mound, we have a conical mounds. And so these kinds of mounds appear to be some of the older mounds Native Americans are building, and these primarily have had association with burials. And so even some of the mounds you might see at Cahokia today don't necessarily have that distinct shape that you see in this picture, and again, that's because they've all been kind of altered to some degree. And the third kind of mound we have here are actually the most common kinds of mounds. These are the platform mounds. And so as you can see, this has a flat top, likely because it would have held a structure, whether that be a ceremonial council lodge or a sweat lodge, maybe the homes of the elite. And so these particular mounds are the ones that the Mississippian culture are starting to build. And this, again, is evident of a very complex society. This picture we have is a picture of a borrow pit. So often you might ask yourself when you look at the mound, where did they get the soil to build these mounds? That is quite a bit of soil, especially if you've looked at Monk's Mound. And so archaeologists have actually uncovered the exact source where the soil is being extracted. And so certain borrow pits fill in with water when there is extensive rainfall. The majority of the borrow pits on site have been filled in by farmers, but the one, like in the picture you can see, does fill in with water. And so this is where archaeologists have noticed that the Native Americans are digging with stone tools or muscle hoes. And so they would dig, as deep as 12 feet. So the picture you're seeing, this is estimated to be about 17 acres and about 12 feet deep. And so this is all physical labor. There were no domestic animals quite yet. The only animal they had was a dog. And so the archaeologists have actually uncovered the baskets that they were using to transport the soil. This is just kind of an example of a basket, not exactly the one that they discovered, but you get the idea. But in the basket, it's interesting, they can see that there's a number of coloration and texture in the soil that indicates they're using clay, silt, and even some looser soils to provide drainage. And so the fact that many of these mounds still stand today, almost nearly 1,000 years ago, 1,000 years later, indicates that the Native Americans clearly had knowledge on soil quality and soil engineering. They weren't just, piling soil up and thinking that it would stand this long. They clearly had some knowledge to be going to these numerous locations to extract the soil. And so these baskets were estimated to weigh 40 to 60 pounds. So that kind of gives perspective in terms of, how much labor was involved. And the fact that, they're building such large mounds means that someone's planning this, someone's organizing this, someone's kind of taking charge of building these very large monumental structures. And so here we have another illustration of what community life may have looked like. And so the homes themselves were semi-subterranean. So when archaeologists find specific neighborhoods, they're finding pit trenches, basically holes in the soil, and many of these are in the shape of rectangles. And so these rectangular shapes indicate where a home may have been. And so over the course of time, archaeologists typically don't find the wood or anything like that. That usually rots away. And so they believe that the average person's home was likely thatched with prairie grasses. And so these homes were actually a lot smaller than what we're accustomed to. They were typically about the size of your bathroom. And that's primarily because people spent their time sleeping there or storing goods. And in the winter, that would keep you warm as well. But it is interesting to see that all these homes appear to be organized around courtyards and even some plazas. So that is, indicative of a social communal life as well. This is a nice picture of what the actual physical pit trenches look like. And as you can see, a few of them do have that rectangular shape to them. Some of these circular shapes might indicate waste disposal areas or possibly areas where they're storing their goods, including their corn. And so if you have a city that's producing large amounts of corn, you have to have somewhere to store it. So some of these areas likely do represent storage areas. And you can see this picture, it's actually in front of the Interpretive Center. And the picture you see here today is actually a neighborhood that is right in front of the Interpretive Center. So that's kind of neat that you can actually see that. If you do come visit the site, again, I understand the Interpretive Center is closed, but that is something neat to see. And so often people ask me, why settle in like Cahokia? What was such a suitable, area for them to establish such a large city? And I always point out this map. This map is the American Bottoms. And as you can see, there are a number of different bodies of water. Not only would the water be great for your crops, it'd also be a form of navigation. So again, there's no horses. You're either walking or using canoes. They've also discovered in excavations what appear to be fish hooks. So we know the Native Americans were fishing. So as you might imagine, looking at all these different lakes, it'd be a great place to go fishing. We're also on the Mississippi Flyway. So depending on the time of the year, we have all kinds of birds migrating through. So it would be a great place to go hunting for waterfowl. And so they have found the animal specimens, such as like a large area where about 1,000 bones of white-tailed deer were discovered. They found bones of waterfowl, swans, and so we know that these specimens were essentially the prey that the Native Americans were consuming. So we know they've had interactions with the different kinds of species. And more or less what I'm trying to get at is that this is a very fertile and abundant, rich resource area. So this would have allowed them to sustain populations of anywhere from 10 to 20,000 people. So I think this is a great map and is representative of why this would have been such a fertile area. And as you can see in the map, there are numerous communities. So you have Cahokia, East St. Louis across the river. And so the fact that you have all these resources allow all these other communities to develop. And so if you kind of look at this map in itself, it's representative more or less of a metropolitan. And so that's why you'll often see that America's first city is often referred as Cahokia. And so around 1050 AD, they noticed that this becomes essentially the first example of an urban center. The majority of the Native American groups prior to this were still moving on through the time, different times of the season. But Cahokia itself actually did arrive in London, England, in about 1250 AD. And so that estimation of 10 to 20,000 people, that's only in the inner city. That doesn't include what we might think of like suburbs, which would include, again, St. Louis, East St. Louis, other communities up along the Mississippi River. So if you include those suburb populations, it could be another 10 to 20,000 people. So we're talking potentially 40,000 people as a metropolitan. To kind of put it into perspective, no other city would reach this size in population until the 1700s, and that would be Philadelphia. So we're talking almost roughly 600 years before this city, this country witnesses another city of that magnitude. And this is obviously before the United States. So here we have a slide that talks about trade and exchange. So here are a couple non-local goods that you don't typically find in the area. And if you guys recall, I had mentioned copper. And so they've uncovered copper that appears to have been formed into jewelry, different copper plates, and around the area they actually uncovered some copper. They found some green residue in the soil that indicates they're heating the copper. So that they believe was possibly at one point a copper workshop. Another interesting thing they've discovered are marine shells and shark teeth. So clearly there are not any sharks around here. But that gives us an idea that they must be in contact with people from the Gulf of Mexico. The Mississippi River itself dumps into the Gulf of Mexico. They've also uncovered an interesting mineral called mica that's generally found in the Carolinas. And chert, so some chert they've discovered that's been formed into arrowheads is actually sourced in Missouri. So this kind of paints a picture for us where the Native Americans may have been traveling, where people may have been coming from. And so these different items may have been, exclusive to religious leaders, maybe the chief, considering there wasn't a whole lot of it. And so this would have been kind of a luxurious kind of item, if you think about it. And so for those of you guys that have visited us, you may have come and seen a couple of our reconstructions of the stockade wall, or at least the guard tower. And so at Cahokia, the Native Americans actually built a palisade, a stockade wall, that would have enclosed about 200 acres. And so this stockade wall was actually constructed 4 different times over the course of 100 years. So about every 25 years or so, they would rebuild this wall. And so in this illustration, you can see that their bastions, their guard towers, for some reason appear to change in shape and size. And so each construction of this wall would have required about 10 to 20,000 logs. And so that's quite a sizable amount of resources being put into this. And so this, the fact that they built it 4 different times means that there must have been, some threat making it important enough for them to put in all this work. What they did notice is with the last construction, the bastion itself appears to shrink substantially. So archaeologists are not 100% sure. Maybe for some reason they're running out of logs, or at least logs that are close enough for them to use. And so that might be why their guard tower itself shrinks. What's kind of strange about the wall itself is it doesn't appear that Cahokia is ever in war or it's ever been under attack. And ways that archaeologists could say that is if they uncover mass-scale graves indicating a large war, or maybe around the area where the wall is at, they'd find a lot of arrowheads indicating it's been attacked. That doesn't appear to be the case here. In general, around the time period they built this wall, it appears the region itself is experiencing more conflict. And so the archaeologists can say this based on some of the war symbols that Native Americans paint around this time. And East St. Louis, actually, around this time was also burned down. The archaeologists aren't sure if it was a ceremonial thing or if maybe they were attacked. But in general, that might have produced enough paranoia that they think, hey, let's put up this wall. And so you might imagine you don't find the wood again over the course of 1,000 years. So how did they uncover where the wall was at? And so this was actually discovered from some aerial photography that was conducted in the 1920s. And so from above, on the eastern side and southern side of the site, they noticed there's light lines in the subsoil appearing it had been disturbed. And so that gave the archaeologists a clue, let's do some excavations there. And so that's where they actually found the physical pit trenches of where these logs would have been placed. And so that's how we have an idea of how large these logs may have been. So based on the diameter, they can see how large the log is itself, and also how deep it is. So if you think about it, you have a 10 to 12 foot pool, you stick it in a foot deep, it's going to fall over. So this is how the archaeologists have a rough idea of how large the structure itself would have been. Outside of it serving that defensive purpose, they think it also would have been a way to kind of cut off this particular area that might have been considered sacred. And so maybe people that had access to this particular part of the site might have been the chief, might have been religious leaders, maybe family of the chief. And so Monk's Mound is within the boundary of the stockade wall. So they think this might have been a very spiritual, ceremonial part of the site, and that might be a reason why they might have constructed this wall. And so here we have an illustration from above, and so here's the stockade wall we had just discussed. And so this eastern side and southern sides where they actually found the physical evidence of where these pit trenches were located. On the northern side, they believe that these creeks here actually would have washed away any evidence. So they haven't actually found the boundary on the northern side. And on the western side, when they conducted the aerial photography in the 1920s, there was just a lot of tree cover, so it really didn't produce anything of significance. But here we have a slide about the Grand Plaza. And so this little area right here is the Grand Plaza. And this might be kind of what you might think of like your town square or a social communal space. The Grand Plaza here itself is actually one of the largest communal spaces in the Americas. And it's approximately 40 to 50 acres. If you visited Cahokia and been around this particular side of the site, you notice how flat it is. It's very, very unnaturally flat. And so the Native Americans actually artificially leveled this portion of the site so that it would have been, flat and usable for these different activities that would include market days, feasts, rituals, even the location of their game Chunky. Have you guys heard of the game Chunky? Okay. Well, we got the next slide that really talks about it. But here's what's thought to be the Chunky field right here. And so Chunky is a game that the Mississippian culture was playing 1,000 years ago. The colonizers encountered certain tribes that still practice Mississippian culture lifestyle playing this game. And even tribes play to this game to this day. I had a little girl on one of my tours tell me that she's Native American and she plays this game with her father. And so this game typically revolved around a stone that was about the size of a hockey puck. The size could vary. And so there'd be one person rolling the stone kind of like a bowling ball, and there'd be a warrior on each side. And each warrior would have a spear, and they would anticipate where this stone will stop rolling. And based on where they thought it would stop rolling, they would throw their spear. And so whoever would hit this stone would win the game. And so it's thought that this game may have originated at Cahokia. It's thought that this game may have been a way to spread their influence. Games tend to bring us together. And it's also thought that maybe it was a way to mediate conflict as well. One thing that's interesting is that it's thought that in the Grand Plaza there may have been a large-scale feast that occurred. And this is based on kind of like a little area that looked like a landfill where they had 1,000 bones of white-tailed deer and other prey they were consuming. And so they think it's possible that in the Grand Plaza, people were feasting, eating, having a good time, while watching Chunky be played. And so that kind of reminds me whatever your favorite sport is. If you like sports, whether that's the Super Bowl, golf, soccer, you eat food and watch sports with family and friends. So that's kind of a concept that doesn't change over the course of time. We're still doing this to this day. And so they think that there might have been gambling involved. This could have been a way to kind of sharpen your skills, whether that's for hunting, maybe even to go to war. The game itself, they found stones at these numerous other locations I had mentioned, so we know that other mound sites were also playing this game. All right, so here we have a slide of Monk's Mound, so you can get a nice little aerial view of the mound itself. This actually is the only mound you can climb, but it is the largest earthen structure in the Americas. And so there are larger pyramids in Mexico and South America. This is an earthen pyramid made of basically all soil. And so this mound itself is about 100 feet high. At its base, it's 14 acres to compare it to the Great Pyramid of Giza, that's 13 acres. There's an estimated 22 million cubic feet of soil. So if you recall the 40 to 60 pound baskets, that's a lot of baskets. And so that's, again, indicative of a lot of work being put into this. And so what's interesting about the stairway where you can climb up today is thought the Native Americans also had their stairs. So they've done some excavations in that area that reveals some kind of stairway. Theirs were likely logs. These stairs were put in 1999, I believe. And so the mound itself has 4 terraces. Got the first terrace, the second, the third, and fourth. And so early archaeologists thought that the construction of this mound would have taken about 300 years. So that would have been essentially the Cahokians' entire existence. But they've done recent core sampling of the soil that indicates it took only 10 to 20 years. So that means that one generation built this mound, and that means someone's spending all their time building mounds. And so if you're dedicating all your time to this, that means someone's got to provide you with clothing, someone's got to provide you with shelter, someone's got to provide you with food. And so this speaks volumes to archaeologists in terms of how important this must have been for the rest of society to be supporting others to dedicate their entire time to building mounds. And from the top of Monk's Mound, you can actually see St. Louis, you can see the skyline, and you can see the arch. And the arch, being a monumental structure, reminds me of Monk's Mound itself. So if you have a relative, a great-grandfather that may have helped build the arch, he's going to remind you every time you drive past it. So it could be a similar concept, who knows. But the mound itself is thought to be the location of where their chief may have counseled from. So he may have had a council lodge up here. And so they've discovered a very large building at the top that's about 104 feet by 48. So this is substantially larger than those average homes that I had referred to being about the size of your bathroom. And so the fact it's a lot larger indicates that it probably had to house a lot of people. So it kind of seems like it might be like a regional council place to meet. And so one thing they always say with archaeologists, is that you can't ever get them to agree on anything. That if you get 2 archaeologists in one room, you're bound to get 3 different opinions. So you might read a book that doesn't necessarily line up with what I'm saying, so kind of keep that in mind. And so Monk's Mound itself, Cahokia, they didn't discover any written language at the site. So we're not sure what these people actually call themselves or the site or even this mound. And so Monk's Mound doesn't sound too Native American, does it? And that's because it's not. It was actually named after some French Trappist monks that were living in the area in the 1800s. And based on what they wrote down, they didn't have a pleasant stay for a number of reasons. And so people thought they lived on top of Monk's Mound. They actually built a garden and an orchard here, but they lived on another mound, Mound 48, which is across the street. But they did have hopes of building some type of chapel onto the top. But that didn't plan out because they actually were here during the Little Ice Age, which was a climatic shift, meaning they probably weren't growing as much food as they would have liked. Also, based on what they wrote down, for some reason they spent a lot of their time sick. Could be they're exposed to elements they haven't been exposed to. And what appears to be the final straw is the New Madrid earthquake that hit in 1811. And so this earthquake was so strong, allegedly you could hear bells ringing in Boston. It had the Mississippi River flowing backwards for about 15 to 20 minutes, and even rerouted the Mississippi River itself. And so they think these combinations of reasons would have led the monks to going back to France. When they initially arrived, it appears they were exiled by Napoleon. Around the time period they decided to head back, it seems like Napoleon's gradually losing power. But ever since then, the name has stuck, Monk's Mound. And so one neat thing they've uncovered near Monk's Mound in excavation is the Birdman tablet. And so it's a tablet that's not very big at all, but it is very symbolic for many reasons. And so on the left-hand side, you can see a human in what appears to be wearing a bird costume. And so you can see there's a beak here, a feather, and this is the human. This backside represents cross-hatching, and this cross-hatching appears to be associated with snakes. And so what we think this might mean is derived from what Native Americans are willing to share with us about what some of these things might represent. And so the Native Americans appear to have a 3-world view in terms of like their ideology. And so the upper world is associated with birds, the sun, the moon. Makes sense. The middle world, that's where me, you, and everyone else is today. And the lower world is associated with snakes, water, and even agricultural fertility. And so we think that this is representative of the three world views. You have the person in the bird-like costume, and then you have the snake scales here. And so they think that the snakes are associated with agricultural fertility and the lower world itself because they've actually uncovered a little mannequin. And this particular little mannequin has an older woman, and this woman is hoeing into a snake with a muscle hoe. And so this snake wraps around her back and blossoms into gourds. And so they know the Native Americans were growing gourds. And the snakes themselves would have been very important for the agriculture. Snakes will eat mice, mice will eat your crops. So there certainly would have been that kind of interpretation, and they certainly would have had the knowledge that the snakes provide a great ecological service for them. Here we have a nice shot of the next largest set of mounds on site. And these are called the twin mounds, not because they look alike, rather because they would have served a dual function. And so these are two different kinds of mounds here. You have a platform mound with a flat top and a conical mound. So if you guys recall, this likely held a building, and this is associated with burials. And so what they believe this was some kind of mortuary complex. And so they think there was possibly some kind of charnel house here on top. And this is where they would have prepared bodies, or at least stored them maybe before they buried them. And it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but the soil in between the two mounds has been lifted partially. And that indicates that there was maybe a bridge there where they would have walked over the bodies to be buried. These two mounds themselves haven't actually been excavated, and that's because there's a lot more rules and regulations in terms of how you can excavate and where you can excavate. So now, if there's an indication of an indigenous person being buried there, you can't dig there at all. And that makes sense. No one wants their ancestors being dug up. But prior to these regulations, other communities that were associated with the Mississippian culture had similar mounds that had similar shapes that were excavated. And that's what archaeologists uncovered. So they believe it likely would have served the same function here at Cahokia as well. One neat thing for those of you guys that haven't visited, or if you want to come visit it again, that they've uncovered at Cahokia was a solar calendar. And so they've actually discovered 5 individual solar calendars. And so these different poles may have marked different times of the seasons, maybe times for rituals, maybe times for festivals. And particular poles, from the center pole, they think there may have been a religious leader, maybe like a sun priest making observations. And so they think that they align some of these poles to the equinox and the solstice. And we actually did have recently, this past Sunday, a talk on site where Bill Eisenmenger, the site expert, gave a talk about the discovery. And so they do that generally on the solstice and equinox. They do a gathering. It's not anything ceremonial. It's just to come together to observe the sunrise. But within the 5 individual solar calendars they discovered, each individual calendar had a different amount of poles. And so the first one had 24, the second one had 36, the third one had 48. For some reason, it's going up by 12. We're not 100% sure what that's about, considering it doesn't appear the Native Americans had a 12-month calendar like we do. If anything, it seems like their time, or at least perception of time, seems to be more cyclical, while ours is linear. It could just be that they're marking different festivals or rituals that might be happening, but we're not 100% sure about that. And so this solar calendar was discovered because in the 1960s, Interstate 55 connecting with 70 was actually supposed to have a ramp going through that area. And so luckily they conducted a last-minute excavation, and this is where they uncovered the pit trenches of the solar calendar. And so in that general location, they've also found slabs of red cedar. And so they believe that the Native Americans were using red cedar. And they've also found red ochre, a pigmentation that the Native Americans likely painted the poles with. And so red cedar itself, it appears to be a very sacred tree to the Native Americans. The red wood itself could symbolize life, blood. And so this is pretty interesting because they've also reconstructed the third solar calendar that the Native Americans built, and they've used some red cedars. And so red cedar is actually the only native evergreen in the area. Unfortunately, it's been primarily deforested, but But they did source out 20 poles from Missouri. So Missouri still has the red cedar, and so some of the poles that we have up there today came from Missouri. What's neat about our reconstruction, though, is that they actually developed the stone tools that Native Americans would have used. And so they made some axes to cut off some of the limbs of the logs. And so some of the markings you see on the poles themselves could be representative of what it may have looked like. So you can actually park down there. There's an area where you can walk around. There's an interpretive sign where you can do some more reading as well. But here in this picture, you can see the sun coming up. And so on the equinox specifically from the center pole, they think the priest was making observations of the sunrise. And on the equinox, it almost looks like Monk's Mound is giving birth to the sun. And so the fact that they're able to line that up quite precisely indicates they must have had astronomical knowledge to do that. And so this is quite interesting to think about, that they're making these observations. And so you can come, again, join us for some of these sunrises if you would like to witness this yourself. And it's quite a powerful image to witness, especially considering they think the chief of Cahokia may have been thought of the brother of the sun. So living so close to the sky, they think he might have had the association of being the brother of the sun. So you might imagine how powerful an image that might be to witness your chief standing on top of this mound as that sun is emerging. And so the decline of Cahokia. There's often a misconception these people up and vanish. Not the case at all. And so around the 1200s, at least the later 1200s, it appears there's some kind of decline. So it seems like a lot of these residential neighborhoods are shrinking. And so there's a couple of different factors that likely would have influenced the Native Americans leaving this site. And so Cahokia, again, with no written language discovered, why do we call them Cahokia if we don't know that's what they call themselves? And so this is actually, named after a Native American tribe that was living in the area when the French arrived in the 17th century. And so these people in their origins didn't build the mounds themselves, don't know who built the mounds, but it's quite likely they're descendants of the Cahokians. But the name itself is named after this particular tribe that just happened to be living in the area. But it is quite likely that many descendant groups included in a language of families, the Algonquian, Caddoan, Daganan, Siouan, Muskogean, all these different language families likely had tribes living there. You'll often see that it's a little bit tricky in terms of kind of trafficking that dispersion out of Cahokia, especially once you factor in the colonizers coming and passing on a lot of diseases, and then the government, Trail of Tears makes that all a little bit tricky to track all these different tribes' migration, or at least movements throughout different regions. But these different tribes, including like the Osage, the Omaha, the Ponca, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, a lot of these tribes have, very strong ties to Cahokia because their migration lines up with archaeological history. And so with that being said, at Cahokia, there was likely multiple tribes living together, maybe not necessarily speaking the same language, yet coexisting. And so I think that, having these different tribes coming together, bringing their different individual traditions, their customs, I think that's really what helped formulate this very influential Mississippian culture that produced innovation to be able to build large structures, including Woodhenge, including the stockade wall, including the mounds. So that's pretty neat to know that there was multiple tribes living at one point at Cahokia. And so here's a couple factors that might have influenced the decline of Cahokia. So there's the thought that maybe there's resource depletion. So if you're putting 10 to 20,000 logs into a stockade wall, that doesn't include the wood you need for your homes, for your tools, for your fires. So maybe they're pushing that tree line a little too far back. And so now the game you're generally hunting is going further and further away. So maybe it's just not practical to go these distances. There's also the thought that these people were also here during the Little Ice Age. So they experienced the Little Ice Age that the monks did a little bit earlier on. But this means that they're probably not able to grow as much food as they would have liked, or at least not produce high yields and surpluses that would have allowed you to sustain populations anywhere from 10 to 20,000. And so this means that maybe just Cahokia itself isn't suitable anymore. If you're not able to grow food either, you might have a little bit of, you might not have as much faith in your chief. So your chief being associated with the sun would be kind of, in charge, or at least supposed to be making these conditions right to be able to grow corn. And so now you don't have faith in your chief. This could produce some political instability. So maybe someone else comes in and seizes power. In general, around this time period, there might just be more warfare and conflict in the region. So although Cahokia itself was never directly attacked, the threat of conflict being there might make people not feel safe living there anymore. There's also the thought that maybe some of their trade routes may have been weakened, so maybe their cultural influence isn't spreading as far as it once had. And there's also the thought of health and disease. And so it appears that many of the Native Americans have a malnourished diet, and so they have an overdependence on corn. And so corn is very sugary, it will rot away your teeth. There's also the thought that if you have that many people living together with no evidence of a sanitation system, diseases could spread. So now not only are you malnourished and you're sick and there's the threat of war, you might just, end up going back to your ancestral lands. And so people may have returned to their ancestral lands or maybe migrated more west towards the buffalo. But ultimately people would have abandoned Cahokia by 1350 AD. And so here we have a picture of our interpretive center. It sounds like some of you guys haven't visited. And so inside it, typically when it's open, there are some world-class exhibits. And so there's some nice dioramas, there's maps, murals. One interesting diorama is the diorama of the village. And so they have an area where there's reflective glass and a bunch of different little village huts and mannequins of people going on with their day-to-day activities. But what's neat is the reflective glass makes it look like there's endless amounts of huts. So it kind of gives you a little bit of perspective of what it may have been like standing, in the middle of a village at Cahokia. So that's something definitely neat to check out. Again, I understand the Interpretive Center is closed, but that'll be something to look forward to. Typically, we have in our theater a movie showing. This movie you can actually access. It's only 14 minutes long. It is on CahokiaMounds.org. So if anyone's interested in watching that movie later on, you can check that out. And it's on our YouTube channel. Right now, we do have seasonal tours, so if you have any family or friends that wants to come out, or you guys want to come out, I know it's a little toasty right now with the heat, but with maybe more favorable climate, come on a cooler day, we do tours, and so we try to take people around for like Monk's Mound or the Grand Plaza, and just give them a little more information, trying to supplement what the museum itself might have provided. And so again, we try to do different activities, including a nature culture hike. So we have an archaeologist from SIUE come and lead a hike. They have Native American art shows. So for anyone that's interested in art, they have generally 2 times a year this market day where different Native American vendors come and they bring their art and they sell it. So that's pretty neat. And one more recent development that they made was actually an augmented reality app. So if you yourself or you know anyone, family, friends that likes playing on the phone and tech kind of thing, this is an app that you can download on your phone that actually provides you with 2 different guided tours. So you have a Monk's Mound tour and a Grand Plaza tour, and it has different stopping points. And it gives you 3D model projections through your phones of what the city may have looked like at a particular area. So that's kind of neat, and something you can do on your own if you don't want to do like a guided tour, or your family friend comes on a day we can't give tours. That's more recent. I do always point out to people it costs $4.99, but keep in mind it does go towards funding our activities, land acquisition, and so the state is always looking to acquire parts of the original site, and so this helps fund some of that. And so the last thing I can think of is like if you guys are in the area, it was only a 30-minute drive from me, so it's not too far. Definitely come visit Cahokia Mounds. If you want to share with family and friends, where the grounds themselves are open, sunrise to sunset. There's short trails as short as 3/4 of a mile and as long as 10 miles. So there's different opportunities for different interests. And if you do want to schedule a guided tour, or you know someone that wants to schedule a guided tour, give us a call. We take reservations. And if you just want any more general information, check out our website, cahokiamounds.org, or Facebook. We also have social media, so that's where we post our different events, our different days. So we recently had a lecture about a purple martin, a particular kind of bird. And so we definitely try to have different activities to try to, again, supplement not having the interpreter center be open. But that's pretty much all I got right now. I can take any questions. But yeah, that's almost right on the dot, 2:44. So I said about 45 minutes. But yeah, go ahead.
In the new interpretive center, what type of exhibits will be there? What can we look forward to seeing?
Absolutely. So the majority of the exhibits are pretty much going to stay the same. What's really being worked on are the mechanical things. So the HVAC system, the fire suppression, security, those are the things that are really being worked on. There's some minor things in the exhibits, such as like painting rails that are being done. But as far as like the exhibits that some of you may have seen, they should be pretty much the same. Great question.
Early in your talk, you indicated that there was evidence of trade with indigenous people near the Great Lakes. You never mentioned, was there waterways from the mound area to the Mississippi? How did they get this trade up the waterways?
Absolutely. So there are waterways. So the Illinois dumps into the Mississippi River. So there would have been these different rivers that would have connected them up to the Great Lakes. I would imagine maybe there's a certain point where you might have to walk, but those two rivers, the Mississippi River and Illinois, would have certainly helped them.
Yeah, but somehow or another they had to get from the mound area to the rivers.
Yeah, and so again, they probably would
canals or anything?
Yeah, here at Cahokia, actually there was two canals that connected to the Mississippi River. And so you may have recalled on one of those illustrations I showed where there was a creek that kind of washed away the evidence of that North Stockade Wall. Those two creeks, Cahokia Creek and Canteen Creek, at one point did connect to the Mississippi River. Very good question. I think you have one.
Is there anything that you have to do to maintain the structure of the mounds themselves?
Yeah, so I mean, for the most part, they just mow the grass. There certainly have been times where there's events that we call slumping. It's kind of like a little landslide. And so occasionally they do have to drill into the mounds to kind of alleviate some of that water buildup, but that doesn't seem to be on a frequent basis. Any other questions? Yes. Oh.
What do you feel there's anything inside of like Monk's Mound, or say it again?
Do you feel like there's anything inside of Monk's Mound?
So there's not like what you might think like of a tomb or anything like that they're aware of. There certainly are probably things in there considering how large of a mound itself is. The mound itself won't ever be fully excavated, although parts of it have been. So to answer your question, we're not 100% sure. And so just kind of to go off of that question too is nowadays they're actually trying to rely more on technological-based practices, including LiDAR, remote sensing, electromagnetic sensing, so things that don't require shoveling, just because that kind of practice of excavating tends to be a little intrusive, I guess you could say. I think, did you have a question?
Yeah, that was my question.
Oh, okay. Any other question? Yes.
Any of their pots or sculptures have anything to do with their religious things other than the God?
No, absolutely, yeah. So we have a Woodhenge beaker here, and so this is thought to have been, or this was discovered near Woodhenge, and so this beaker has like kind of like a cross symbol on it, and so this cross symbol again might be like a connection to these different realms of existence. So this is kind of representative of that. Also like the Birdman, so at numerous locations associated with the Mississippian culture, they have found bird-like figures. So they've found like in Picture Cave, it's in Missouri, they have found rock art, so petroglyphs and pictographs with bird-like figures. So they think the bird itself was a very important kind of spiritual symbol. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but okay. Any other question? All right, well, I do have brochures. If anyone's interested, you're more than welcome to take these home. If anyone wants to come come and get a closer look at the artifacts. These are replicas. You're more than welcome to touch them. But other than that, that's all I have for you guys. Thank you guys for having me.
Mexico to the south. Well, the Indians
I mean, I'm not 100% sure they can tell a difference. I definitely know that the culture down in Mexico were kind of separated in terms of like origins and migration. I'm not too sure, but you know, you often see the symbols and you think of like the Mayans, the Aztecs, because they had a lot of similar symbols. But there's no physical artifacts discovered in Cahokia. But like in New Mexico, Arizona, they have found artifacts that are Mesoamerican. So that's how they know they certainly had that connection. I'm not ruling out they didn't know of the Mesoamerican culture, but as far as having like a connection physically like that, they can't really say that about Cahokia.
but you encapsulated a large area of the United States, southern large area, as being part of the Mississippian culture. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the Mississippian culture in itself could have been its own powerhouse, kind of like what you think of the Mesoamerican culture.
Where'd you go to school?
So I went actually to school down in Southern Illinois, University of Carbondale. So yeah, like I had mentioned, I grew up near Springfield, a town called Beardstown, Illinois. Most people haven't heard of it. The only reason anyone's heard of it is because Lincoln had a famous court trial there, actually. He proved a man innocent of murder using an almanac. And so someone was accusing this particular man of murder based on some moonlight that was out that day, or that night. And so Lincoln